Hey folks, welcome back to Intro to Philosophy. This is Unit 3, Lecture 4 on Materialism, another exploration into the kinds of views one might have in metaphysics and the philosophy of mind, essentially asking what kinds of thing are human beings? What kind of things? Getting my plurals mixed up. Either way, today we're looking at the reading On Functionalism and Materialism by Paul Churchland as part of our ongoing investigation of metaphysics. So today we're going to be following our usual pattern with a couple of slight notes. So we're going to start off with an overview of what materialism is and Churchland's main goal, including how it relates to dualism and especially wanting to clarify a lot of the vocabulary in today's reading. So I know this reading is a lot longer and a bit denser than some of the others we've looked at in this unit. Honestly, it's because it's an overview of a few different kinds of materialism before we ever actually get to Churchland's own position that he argues for. So there's a lot of things to make sure we have straight before we get to the arguments, and so for the sake of time, there's a few arguments that I'm going to gloss over a little bit. Now, if I'm not going into massive detail about it, it's because it's probably not that important for you to know, so don't worry about it. I'm the instructor, I get to decide what I test on, so you're not going to be tested on anything that I don't go over in these lectures, or looked at in the journals. So if we spend less time on something that you might have hoped, don't stress out about it too much. It's intentional, I promise. Then we're going to wrap up with our usual food for thought and ways of evaluating Churchland's position. So, just as a recap, in this unit we're discussing the philosophy of mind, or more specifically, we're focusing on metaphysical questions about the nature of human beings and what we are, which involves asking and discussing a lot of important questions about mind. Because for the most part, we've got bodies, we know that, we're at least somewhat physical, unless you're some form of an idealist, and we'll get to that. But we know we've got physical bodies. It's the mind that causes all the tricky philosophical puzzles. So we've got to know how exactly do we classify the mind, and what does that mean for what kind of a thing are we? Now in the intro, we looked at three kinds of answers to this question. We looked briefly at dualism, materialism, and idealism. Dualism being the view that we have both physical and non-physical parts, that is, mental and physical. Materialism, which is the position that we're solely physical beings, we have no non-physical components. And idealism, which is the reverse of materialism and says that we are solely mental or non-physical things. Now in past lectures, we've spent some time on Descartes' view of dualism, called substance dualism, and then Ryles's critique of that position. Now if you recall, and this might have bugged you a little bit, Ryles never actually gave us a positive view of what he thought human beings actually are. He just offered a lot of critique. He ended up arguing that dualism, as far as being an explanation of human beings, is kind of crappy. It makes a rather fundamental error, what he called the category mistake. He says that substance dualists treat the mind as a thing that is a real, existing, separate thing, just like the body. It's just made of a different substance. It's made of mental substance, not physical substance. And this, according to Ryle, is a really big mistake. It's wrong to treat the mind as a separate, existing, real thing the same way that the body is. It may be different, it may have a lot of different properties, but trying to compare them like separate things is a mistake. Now, if it bugged you that Ryles never explained what the mind might be if it's not a thing, well, then today's probably your lucky day. If while or around watching this video, you also had a lot of lucky things happen to you. Today we're actually going to look at what the mind might be if it's not a substance, and kind of flesh out some varieties of different materialist positions. So that means we're going to be looking at least 2 or 3 different kinds of materialism. And by materialism, in case you've been a little confused on this the whole time, I'm not meaning an obsession with getting a lot of awesome stuff, the kind of misplaced values that are often attributed to Western society. Instead, the materialism we're discussing is a category of view that says that human beings are solely physical things, that we have no non-physical parts like souls or minds. And that's not saying that we don't think, but just that we don't have a non-physical component that you can call a mind that's separate from or different from the brain or some other part of the body. Materialism furthermore rules out any possibility of dualist explanations of human beings. Where there are different varieties of dualism that might have different allowances for how much you talk about mind. Materialism overall Even if it uses the language of mind, generally it's saying that the mind isn't a real thing. And so, like dualism, it can come in a lot of different versions, and they take different approaches, different attitudes towards like language and discussion of mind. And we'll see what I mean by that here in a few minutes. But it's in its most radical forms, materialism can imply that there are no such things as beliefs, desires, or emotions. That these are just things that you mistakenly think that you have. And again, you'll see kind of what I mean here in a few minutes. But the guy that we're going to be looking at in order to go over all this is a fellow by the name of Paul Churchland. And he's a living contemporary philosopher who focuses a lot on philosophy of mind and metaphysics. And in this reading, coming from his most famous work from the 1980s, Churchland discusses a couple of different versions of materialism before moving on to the one that he considers to be better than the rest, the one that he thinks is actually true. And so in his piece, he's going to end up advocating for one position over the other. But before we get into how he goes about doing this, I think it's worthwhile to take a few minutes to actually get the vocab down straight, because he's going to talk about a lot of different theories, and it's worthwhile if you can keep them distinct and really understand what they are. So overall, he talks about 4 different theories: reductive materialism, functionalism, folk psychology, and eliminative materialism. Now, he doesn't spend much time on folk psychology, or what you might also call a folk theory about mind. He really only discusses in detail reductive materialism, functionalism, and eliminative materialism, which are all versions of materialism, if the names didn't give that away somewhat. Folk psychology is a form of dualism, and he briefly discusses it, but he doesn't go into a lot of detail. But his main focus out of all of these, the thing that he's actually going to end up advocating for, is eliminative materialism, what I'm also going to call EM throughout the rest of this lecture. So, reductive materialism, functionalism, and EM are all forms of materialism. But what are the differences? This is the sort of thing I want to take some time and clear up. So each of these views, keep in mind, are attempts at explanation. They're trying to explain what a human being is. In particular, because of their forms of materialism, each of these positions is trying to explain our intuitions about having non-physical parts. They're going to have to explain why it is you think that you have a mind, or you have emotions and beliefs and thoughts and all these other things that you can't discover if you physically examine a human being. We've got electrical impulses, we've got patterns of brain activity, but you still have to add an extra component to your theory to explain what all the mental versions of those things are, if there are versions of them at all. Again, that's going to be something that the theories address. Now, folk psychology is the label that, if we're going to start going into the labels of positions, folk psychology is the name for the kind of position that Churchland is referring to when he discusses the ordinary, common view of what human beings and the mind are. So folk psychology is literally what the ordinary person thinks. If you grab somebody random off the street, folk psychology is going to be the view that they most likely endorse. It's thus a form of dualism. And essentially, it's not systematic, it's not philosophically rigorous, but folk psychology essentially is going to say that human beings have bodies, but we also have non-physical mental states like beliefs and desires and choices and intentions and thoughts and all these other things. And it treats these mental states as real, actual things. But unlike some forms of substance dualism or just other forms of philosophical dualism, folk psychology isn't going to be very systematic about it. It's just going to be the loose, just intuitive response of an ordinary person. Now, when we get to the actual forms of materialism, we start getting into the systematic theories, the things that philosophers actually hold. Now, reductive materialism, what Churchland also refers to as the identity theory in the reading, states that our minds and our brains are identical, or if we're talking about them and giving explanations, we can reduce our minds down to our brains. In other words, reductive materialism, or identity theory, are named these things because they say that we can explain the mind in terms of the brain, and that only the brain is actually real or fundamental. It essentially says that there's a one-to-one correspondence, there's a matchup between every mental event and every brain event. So if you're feeling hungry, there is one and only one brain state going on in your actual physical body. And then it goes on to say that when you feel hungry, you're not really having like a mental event of some kind. There's not actually a mind that's feeling hungry. Instead, what's really going on, the truth of the matter, is that there's a brain event happening. There's a particular individual brain event that is identical to your sensation of being hungry. So it reduces the mental, it explains the mental in terms of the more basic and the more real category of brain events. It reduces the mind in its explanations down to the brain. It says that really, the truth of it is, the brain's doing stuff and nothing else. So that's reductive materialism, or identity theory. Same thing, two names for the same idea. Functionalism is rather similar to it. It's going to do the same kind of reductive explanation. It's going to still trying to explain the mind in terms of the brain. But functionalism emphasizes different parts and has some slight differences. So it's almost the same, but it's going to claim that there are multiple brain states that could map to a given mental state. So it's going to say that really the distinctive part isn't a one-to-one identity or like equivalence thing. It's not going to say that being hungry is neurons 16, 23, and 12 firing all together. That's the sort of thing that reductive materialism would say. It would say that feeling hungry is these three neurons firing, and that's all feeling hungry really is. Functionalism is going to say almost the same thing. But instead of saying it's going to be 16, 12, and 23, it can say, or it will say, it's going to be either 16, 12, and 23, or it's 17, 12, and 23 firing together. Either one of those leads to hunger. The point is for functionalism is that there's a relationship, a reductive relationship between the brain and mental events, but there's a little bit of fuzziness as to which brain events match up. So it still allows for things like different people's brains might be wired a little differently, or it might help us still explain things like, say, if a Martian felt hungry, we could still make analogous claims even if they don't precisely have the same neurons firing. So there's a function, there's a mathematical relationship between the mind and the brain. And the brain's the real thing going on, but there's not a one-to-one matchup. It's just a more open-ended mathematical relationship that can be defined by a function. Now, both of these kinds of views, if you can't tell, are forms of materialism because they treat the physical, material, matter parts of us, the brain, as being the most basic and fundamental components of what's going on in a human being. In other words, they explain human beings in purely material terms. They say, yeah, we can talk about mental stuff, but really what's going on is physical things. The brain's doing this, not the mind. So this is why both of these are still forms of materialism, despite the fact that they talk about mental events and beliefs and desires and intentions and so on. Now, all of these, the folk psychology and the other two forms of materialism, are really different from Churchland's real focus, EM, or eliminative materialism. Now, EM is the view that not only are human beings solely physical entities, but we should actually eliminate non-physical terms and ideas like thoughts, beliefs, intentions, ideas. We should actually eliminate these terms and these concepts entirely from our theories and our discussions and our explanations of what a human being is. Essentially, it's saying that a sufficiently mature neuroscience, that is, if we get science to discover enough things, then we can actually totally explain human beings and human behavior without ever having to talk about things like thoughts, beliefs, and intentions. These concepts of beliefs and intentions and thoughts, these are all just convenient shorthands we used when we didn't really understand the brain, according to EM. So, we should actually stop talking about them. Not only are your thoughts and beliefs reducible down to a mental state, but there are no such things as thoughts and beliefs and desires. You don't ever actually have thoughts or beliefs, and you should stop talking about them. You should eliminate them from our discourse and from our discussions. Thus the name, eliminative materialism. So, when Churchland in his article argues that EM is the best available explanation of what a human being is, he's essentially saying that other explanations that do make reference to mental stuff, like reductive materialism or functionalism, that these other explanations are kind of mistaken. They're actually worse explanations because they're referring to things that don't really exist. Now, if any of this seems a little strange to you, I know it's really heavy stuff. So we're going to go over just another brief illustration and then get into the arguments themselves, which will hopefully help illustrate things. And again, always feel free to pause the video, write down your questions, go back over it again more slowly, go back to the reading, and shoot me any questions you have. I'm here to help. Promise. So, just to give another illustration of eliminative materialism, because I know it's kind of weird to grasp. Let's look back to dualism for just a second. Which is the same, or going to be a more detailed version of folk psychology, just the ordinary view off the street. Most people, and all dualists, think that a human being is made up of both a body and a mind. So most people think that you've got this public, physical, law-abiding thing, a body made of matter, that's also controlled by and interacts with a totally separate thing that's called the mind. And this mind is a real existing thing. It's non-material, it's private, it follows all these other rules and has these other properties that we discussed last time. So that's what most people think, and this is what dualists think. So thus it's both folk psychology and dualism. Eliminative materialism is going to say that we should eliminate the concept of mind entirely from our explanations of human beings. It does nothing for us. We should eliminate this category from all of our explanations. You might have noticed that this entire unit I've been stressing the fact that dualism, materialism, and idealism are explanations of what a human being is. And this is kind of why. Because what these theories are doing is they're trying to explain what a human being is. They're trying to give a detailed account of what we are and why we experience the world in certain ways. Like, why do these certain things keep happening? Why do they seem this way? So really they're explaining the how and the why life is how it is. Eliminative materialism says that all of those explanations should stop using the category of the mental. It does nothing for us. It's possible to explain everything totally in physical and material terms. So we should stop even using words and concepts like beliefs, ideas, emotions, intentions. There are no such things, and there's no point in referring to them, even if you acknowledge that there's no such thing. So where reductive materialism or functionalism might still use the category of the mental in their explanation, they're saying they're not real. Eliminative materialism says not only is it not real, you should stop using those terms in that language. There's no point to it. So, that's a general overview of what eliminative materialism and the other positions are. This should hopefully give you the vocabulary you'll need to actually start getting into the real arguments and probably get a better idea of why Churchland says that it's such a great thing to eliminate beliefs and intentions and other mental language from our discourse. So keep in mind that sort of saying why we should eliminate it is Churchland's main goal. His overall purpose in the article is to argue for EM over other competing theories. So to do this, the structure of his article is essentially he's going to devote a section each to discussing reductive materialism, functionalism, and EM. And in each section, he's going to have a bit going arguments for and arguments against. He's nice and systematic this way. He's got wonderful headings. Honestly, we've got some pretty clear authors in this unit and in the class. Honestly, a lot of philosophy isn't done this way, and it's kind of nice when it does have the nice labels to it. Then, after each of these labeled sections, he briefly considers, are the objections worth, are they really good objections? Is there sufficient reason for us to choose one theory over the other? And spoiler alert, he ends up saying that eliminative materialism is the best theory, even if there are a couple of wonky bits to it. So, let's go in the order of the text and start with reductive materialism. And again, if you're not familiar with this vocabulary, if you're not comfortable with it yet, pause the video, go back, and make sure you've got the concepts down, because I'm not going to clarify the positions quite as much in this next part. Alright, so, reductive materialism. We've covered what the view is. Why would somebody think it? What are the arguments for it? Well, first off, Churchland begins by saying that there's historical precedent for reductionist theories. The kinds of theories that reduce one thing to another, and when you're trying to explain what it is pretty common, especially in science. Especially in science. So take light, for example. Current theories reduce light down to electromagnetic waves. photons are funky and light's weird, so sometimes it's a wave, sometimes it's a particle. But essentially, current theories reduce light down to fluctuations in a magnetic field. It's electromagnetic waves. Now, we experience light one way, that is, as light, as these big shining areas of space and that sort of thing. But really what it is it's not a substance or a clear particle or anything like that. Really, light's just waves of energy in a particular spectrum. And we do this sort of thing with a lot of different aspects. Like, really, the table in front of you or the computer in front of you, isn't a solid object. It's made of little tiny things that are actually largely empty space. The truth of the matter is that the computer in front of you is made of tiny particles that are largely empty space. They're just interacting via very strong forces and a couple weak ones. So, reductive theories are pretty common in science. And when we combine the fact that there have been a lot of reductive theories in the past with the kind of progress that neuroscience has made just in the last 50 years, neuroscience honestly is a pretty new field as far as science goes. It seems possible, at least plausible, that one day we might be able to prove that the mental really is something just physical, that we might be able to reduce the mental to the physical in our explanations. Secondly, not only does it seem possible, but science actually has been seemingly pointing us in that direction. The more that we learn about science and the more we learn about human beings and the brain and psychology, it seems to be that there are physical causes for a lot of our behavior and thought processes. We're not nearly as random and spontaneous as we used to think. So in one argument, for example, Churchland points out that genetics, the source of our characteristics, is a purely physical process, and yet it influences a lot of our decisions and the way that we think. So there's, seemingly some evidence that says that our thoughts are caused by physical stuff, and that only really makes sense if our thoughts themselves are also physical processes. Because only, remember, physical things interact with physical stuff. Non-physical things, kind of by definition, they can't be poked or prodded or influenced by physical stuff. And in another argument, Churchland says the same thing about evolution. Evolution selects for certain physical traits and causes, and although you may have your own individual feelings about evolution, the science is pretty clear. Biology has a pretty large consensus that evolution is natural selection is a rather real and important influence on what kind of traits and whatnot are successful and existing in current living things. So that said, there's some reason to think that perhaps a reductive view about the mental is the correct view, but there's some arguments against it as well. Dualists, for example, can respond pretty directly that mental states, all you've got to do is kind of reflect and think about your own experience, just use some introspection, and you can see that they're different from other physical states. My being hungry is different from my brain firing in certain ways. Like, I'm not feeling the electrical impulses. I'm feeling like there's a hole in my stomach. I'm feeling a particular kind of experience, a particular kind of phenomenon that's just radically different from a physical state. Or like when I'm feeling heartbroken, I literally feel certain, emotions and sensations that don't match up with what's going on in the physical world. However, Churchland thinks that there are replies to this kind of argument. Churchland points out that our every perception is really just picking up on subtle physical differences in states, even when we can't identify them. So why not think that our thoughts do the same thing? They seem like they're really different, that they're totally independent of physical stuff. But it seems plausible and possible that our minds are really just picking up on subtle physical changes that we're not aware of yet. Furthermore, and this is one of the more detailed arguments that Churchland goes over, and I'm going to gloss over it a little bit. Somebody might argue against reductive materialism by saying that mental and brain states have different properties and are thus totally different. We can't reduce one down to the other because of a thing called Leibniz's law. Leibniz's law is named after a very famous historical modern philosopher, like Renaissance period modern guy, who is also known for his mathematics and stuff. He disputedly co-invented calculus alongside Isaac Newton, independently, but at the same time. So either way, Leibniz is a guy who ended up arguing for a concept of identity. Ended up giving us a criterion for when two things are identical. And so Leibniz's law says that if any two things are identical, then they must have the exact same properties. So if X has properties 1, 2, and 3, and Y has properties, or if X and Y are identical, then Y must also have properties 1, 2, and 3. This is also sometimes known as the indiscernibility of identicals. So in other words, if two things are identical, they must have the exact same properties. If there's one difference at all between them, they're not identical. They're not numerically one and the same thing. Now, dualists, or opponents of reductive materialism, will say that mental and physical states, brain events and mental events, have different properties. In particular, they'll often point to things called qualia, like the subjective what it's like to experience something. They'll say, well, seeing red has all these different properties of being intense, and it's bright, and it feels a certain way, and your eyes picking up wavelengths of a certain electromagnetic spectrum doesn't carry nearly the same properties. Additionally, the physical processes have properties the mental events don't have. The mental stuff doesn't seem to make reference to any of the same things, so because they're different, that seems to violate Leibniz's law, according to dualists, and thus, you might say that they're radically different. You can't reduce one to the other. Or so the objection goes. Now, Churchland says that this is actually mistaken. It's not actually true that brain states and mental states are actually that radically different. He says that it's possible, or even likely, according to him, that the supposed differences between mental states and brain states aren't really differences at all. And this is the kind of part where I'll start glossing over. He starts going over like the meanings of terms and that sort of thing, or the way that we might use words about what it means to know something. But essentially, he's going to be saying overall that the differences that dualists or other people say exist between brain states and mental states, they're not real differences at all when you actually get down to the nitty-gritty science of what's going on, or the nitty-gritty metaphysics of what's going on. They're not different at all, therefore they don't violate Leibniz's law. So, according to Churchland at least, none of these objections to reductive materialism stand. So reductive materialism seems like a really plausible theory to hold. But we still don't know if it's the best explanation. So he goes on. Churchland starts discussing the view functionalism, which is similar to identity theory, to reductive materialism, but it's the view, more generally, that the brain relates in specific ways to mental states, but just not as cleanly and one-to-one, matchup-like as the identity theory. The important part of the functionalism theory, remember, is that the brain relates to and causes the mental, that really what's going on are just brain states, and that the brain is causing the mental states, that it relates to the mental things in a certain way. So that each instance, each individual mental event matches with and is reducible to a physical event, even if, like every instance of that mental thing doesn't match up with those particular neurons every time. And again, the physical event's the more fundamental and the more real of the mental and the physical. So the mental reduces down to the physical, same as with the reductive materialism. It's just not as clean a reduction as in the other one. There's a little more fuzziness, a little more wiggle room. Now, this view, you could probably raise some of the same objections that you could for reductive materialism, but the things about identity don't really apply so much. So there are some unique objections that get raised against functionalism. And a common one has to do with an idea about colors. And this is probably something that you might have actually thought of at some point yourself. So with functionalism, part of the point is that what's going on in the brain relates to the mental in a particular way. So that, say, if one person is experiencing the color red and another person is experiencing the color red, what's going on in their brains might be a little bit different, but it's going to be analogous. It's going to be matching up to be the same kind of brain event, even if the individual instances don't quite match up. Now, some people have pointed out that it's entirely possible that the mental events don't actually match up with what's going on here. It kind of breaks the function relationship. It's entirely possible that what I experience as red is really the same as your experience of green. We just happen to call it red in my case. So like I'm experiencing something and I call it red, and you're experiencing something, and you call it red, but our somethings aren't the same. In which case it seems like the functionalism relationship, the relationship between the brain and the mind, isn't quite what functionalism says. They're not really matching up in the same way. Now, Churchland says this isn't really an objection at all. This isn't really a problem, because there's still an analogy. You'd never know if the two somethings we're experiencing never matched up. So there's really no point in worrying about it. It's not really an objection to functionalism, Churchland says. So this isn't a very good critique. And then he applies the same kind of reasoning, saying that these supposed mismatches aren't really problems in even a couple of other arguments, which are largely the same. Excuse me. He'll say that perhaps if somebody was lacking a certain mental state, or if we had difficulty drawing analogies between us and, say, Martians, that these aren't really problems for functionalism either, and that really people are just kind of dumb for raising these objections. He never actually says that. He's much more polite about it, but that's kind of the implication. That none of these objections about mismatches between one person's experience and another, that none of these really harm functionalism in any way. So functionalism is also, according to Churchland, a plausible materialist theory. But he wonders about whether or not they're the best theories. And so instead, he advocates for and considers his own pet theory, eliminative materialism, EM. And he starts wondering, why would one want to be an eliminative materialist over other kinds of materialist? Why endorse EM over the other kinds of materialism, and why would you endorse it over folk psychology? Why would you be an EM materialist instead of a dualist? Well, Churchland argues, first off, that folk theories should kind of be doubted in the first place. Historically, folk theories are usually very, very, very wrong. They're horrible, not very well thought out attempts to explain what's going on. And historically, this has been proven true time after time after time. For example, historically, there have been folk theories about just about everything. There used to be, or there perhaps still are among less educated folks, theories about how sight works, how heat works, how oxidation works, and so on. And each of these theories have been proven wrong at some point. For example, in the past, heat actually used to be considered a kind of fluid. Like when you see a fire or a candle burning or a really hot oven, you see the distortion in the air, that kind of shimmery area. People used to think, as a matter of common opinion, as a folk theory, that heat then was a kind of really fine, thin fluid that moved through things. And so the hotter something got, the more of this fluid, called caloric, was in the thing. And the colder it got, the less caloric there was inside of the thing. So they used to think that heat was a fluid, and that was the commonly accepted folk theory. That was the thing that almost everybody thought about heat. But if you've had much science at all, you know that this is dead, dead wrong. Heat's just the transfer of energy. It's not even a real thing. It's not a physical thing at all. It's just our experience of the movement of thermal energy. Similarly, people used to very widely believe that oxidation, like rust and fire and combustion and all this was caused by the interaction of a substance called phlogiston with the air and with other substances. And so that when phlogiston was in every single substance, releasing it caused fire, it caused rust. So when you let the phlogiston out of something and it interacted with the air, stuff happened. But it turns out there's no such thing as phlogiston. There's just oxygen. And oxygen causes certain interactions. But there was no separate material called phlogiston that did any of this stuff that everybody used to think was the case. Similarly, everybody used to believe that witches were a real thing, but really there was just mental delusions and people using horrible political and privileged power over others, and so on and so forth. With virtually everything, people used to think that space was filled up with a fluid called the ether, just so on and so forth. Folk theories, historically and traditionally, have been proven wrong time and time again. And Churchland points this out, that folk theory probably is not a very good explanation in the first place. So you should be a little bit doubtful even before we get to solid arguments why one view is better than the rest. But just to cement his kind of position, Churchland then offers 3 arguments. They're pretty quick, but they're rather straightforward and powerful arguments nonetheless. So the first argument that Churchland has is targeting against folk psychology again. He says that the basic parts of folk psychology, things like mind and belief and intentions and choices and all this, they're largely unexplained. Folk theory doesn't go into any in-depth explanation of what these things are, which for an explanatory theory is a pretty big failure. If you've got a theory that explains what's going on, you need it to actually explain stuff. And this is especially something that folk theory can't explain. We start getting to fringe cases, the less common instances, things like damaged brains or people with genetic abnormalities, birth defects and the like. So folk psychology, as far as explanatory theories go, is kind of crappy. It just doesn't explain a lot of things. So there's one reason why you shouldn't believe in folk psychology, according to Churchland. Another argument he gives, also targeting his folk theories, is sort of an application of the historical thing. It says that folk theories have been often wrong in the past, so you should doubt them in the first place. But take it a step further. Why would you ever assume that this folk theory, unlike all the others, was ever correct? Why would you even give it that kind of status? Based on all the historical failings so far. So, again, Churchland's arguing you shouldn't endorse folk theory over EM. Thus, by analogy, you shouldn't endorse dualism over EM. Now, the third argument that Churchland gives is a little more targeted just towards materialism. The third argument essentially says that a limited materialism has a number of conceptual advantages. He calls them a priori advantages, things that you can know about prior to testing them in the field. A limited materialism, he says, has a number of these conceptual advantages over other theories, especially over other theories of materialism. Namely, EM is a much simpler theory. You don't have to go out in the world and test that EM is a better theory. You can just see that it's conceptually simpler than the other version of materialism, because it never has to talk about the mental. You see, people often actually misquote Occam's razor. The famous theory that the simplest theory is always best. It's not just that it's simple. In order to actually be a fulfillment of Occam's razor, the principle of parsimony, it's more known as more technically, the idea is that you shouldn't have more categories of stuff than you actually need in your theory. The original phrasing was, one shouldn't multiply entities needlessly in one's theories. So the idea is that because a limited materialism just totally eliminates the category of the mental from their explanations, they've got one less category that they've got to explain and refer to in their discussions. Therefore, it's more likely to be true. As an example of this sort of idea outside of the reading, consider the theory of gravity. So the current scientific theory of gravity is largely Newton's idea with some additions and revisions. But it essentially says that objects just exert a certain force over each other. It isn't really even a force. They warp space-time and cause certain things. But suppose that it's just objects exerting attraction on each other. Compare that to the theory that gravity is the work of invisible trolls and gnomes, where the gnomes are pulling things up and the trolls are pulling things down, and because the trolls are stronger, objects fall. Now, both of these are explanations of what gravity is. Both of these are theories that try and explain the phenomenon and the experiences that we have in the world. They try and explain why the world is the way that it is. But obviously, the theory that says that objects just attract each other due to being made of matter is a lot simpler than the trolls and gnomes theory. For one, there's no trolls and gnomes. You don't have to add these totally separate, invisible things in order to make the theory work. And because you don't have to add as many things to it, it's more likely that it's true. There are less little boxes you have to check off for it to be the true theory. So the more complicated a theory gets, the more things have to be true out in the world for the theory to be true. Thus, it's less likely to be true. It still could be. Perhaps there are invisible, intangible gnomes and trolls rolling around. It just really isn't very likely at all. So the simpler theory is the one that's more likely to be true, because it's got fewer components to it. And because a limited materialism can try and explain thoughts, beliefs, etc., in terms of purely physical things without even referencing the mental, it's the simpler theory. And because it's simpler, Churchland says, it's more likely to be true. So there's a pretty solid conceptual reason, Churchland says, to endorse eliminative materialism over other kinds of materialism. Now, yeah, it's kind of counterintuitive and it might not be true, but there's at least some reason to endorse this over the others. Now, being a good philosopher, Churchland does actually consider arguments against his own view, though he does believe that there are direct and simple answers to each of these. Perhaps the most intuitive objection that somebody might raise, especially that a dualist might raise, is to say that it's pretty obvious that we actually do have desires and intentions and beliefs and all that. All you've got to do is just think for a second. It seems pretty obvious to all of us that there are actually such things as these. You don't really have to prove it. You don't have to go out and do a test about it. It's as obvious as saying that the external world is there, that there's actually stuff around me. And to say that there aren't such things as beliefs and intentions and thoughts is honestly just kind of ridiculous. Now, to this, Churchland says that this is begging the question. Now, for just a brief aside, begging the question does not mean it raises the question. If you ever use begging the question to mean that it raises a certain question, that there's something still worth asking, then I will find you and I will beat you with a logic textbook until you get this right. Begging the question... I'm joking here, for the record. This is not a threat, I promise. Begging the question, in reality, is a particular kind of logical fallacy. It's assuming an answer to a question that's actually worth asking. In this case, Churchland is saying that simply saying it's obvious that there are beliefs and desires and whatnot is assuming that EM isn't true. It's assuming that such things actually exist, which is really the question that we're trying to answer here. So because you're just assuming the answer in the first place, you're making a mistake. Thus, according to Churchland, the first objection doesn't work. Another objection might raise is that you might do the same kind of thing that we've been doing for past lectures and past readings. You might try and find an incoherence or a mistake in the logic of the actual argument. You might say it's not a valid argument, that the premises don't lead to the conclusion. And I'll gloss over the details of it, but essentially it says that there's a certain kind of incoherence to the argument that eliminative materialism makes. It says, it implies that there's a contradiction going on somewhere. And Churchland says that this contradiction just simply isn't there, that you're a really bad logic student if you think that there's a contradiction going on in any of this stuff. Now, the third objection that Churchland considers is the one that he considers the most plausible, that there might actually be something to this one. The third objection says that one might say that all the arguments for eliminative materialism kind of exaggerate the failures of the other theories. They kind of say that, well, false psychology has some gaps, but they're not nearly as big as eliminative materialism makes them sound. Where it says, or you might say that, reductive materialism and functionalism aren't honestly that much more complicated than EM. There's really not that big of a difference there. And to this, Churchland says there might actually be something to that one. EM is really unintuitive, so it might, keyword might be the case that EM isn't true and that rather one of the other versions are. But he still thinks overall EM's the best theory. Now, we come to the part where we actually have to ask ourselves, was Churchland right? Did he accomplish his project, and did he say that EM is a better explanation than the other theories? He gives a lot of reasons and arguments why it might be the case, but he's not God. He's not giving the final answer on any of this sort of thing. There are actual replies that you can make to the kinds of arguments that Churchland gives. The most straightforward argument is really to kind of re-emphasize the obviousness of our beliefs and desires and intentions. And although Churchland says that this is kind of begging the question, I think this is actually probably one of the best replies you can give. But personally, this is just my personal opinion. You will never be counted off for disagreeing with it. Personally, I don't think that EM is the case. I do think that human beings do have mental stuff like beliefs and choices and intentions and all the rest of it. EM is just way too implausible a theory. It's too crazy to think that we don't actually have these things. It seems totally obvious to us. And giving up and having to say that all of these obvious intuitions and seemings are wrong, that's a really high theoretical cost. That's any theory that says that we don't have beliefs and thoughts has a pretty big strike against it just from the start. And we'll see how this kind of argument might still be successful, saying that it's just plain obvious you shouldn't question it, or that even if you do question it, you should still conclude that it's true. We'll see how this works a little bit more when we get to Unit 4, where a fellow by the name of G.E. Moore argues from very obvious evidence that the external world, the world outside your own head, actually exists, and you've got reason to believe it. So we'll spend a little more time on this kind of objection later. But there are other replies that you can still make to a limit of materialism. For example, simpler theories are more likely to be true, more likely to be correct in theory, in concept. But it's also possible for theory to get too simple, for it to get simpler than reality actually demands. And that means that it's actually possible that things are more complicated than your theory might imply. So for example, if we're just comparing theories about what kind of elements exist, the original classical theories from ancient Greece and so on, that there are only 4 elements, fire, water, earth, and air, those theories were a lot more simple than our theory about elements nowadays, where we have hundreds of elements, or 100 and something elements. I forget how many we've lately created. The theory that there are 4 elements as opposed to 120, the 4 elements theory is a lot simpler. There are fewer things you have to account for. You can just say that everything's made of combinations of this. Or if you want to even get more simple than that, a very ancient philosopher, pre-Socrates, a fellow by the name of Heraclitus, argued that the entire world is made of fire. There's slow-moving fire, and there's quickly-moving fire, and there's hot fire and cold fire, but the entire world is made of fire, according to Heraclitus. Now, obviously, that's much more simple than our current theories. But it's possible to get too simple in your theory and start leaving things out. It's possible for you to get more simple than reality actually is. So the simplest theory may be more likely to be true, but that doesn't mean that it actually is. So simply saying that we should believe EM because it's the simplest theory isn't actually that great of a reason to believe it. It helps. If we've got really closely competing theories, we should probably go with the simpler one. But EM on a whole, because it says that we don't have things that seem pretty obvious to us, well, it's not really all that great of a competitor in the first place. So you shouldn't just go straight for the simplest theory. Simplicity is a virtue, but accuracy is too. And lastly, it's worth noting that even Churchland says that a limit of materialism might be a little too extreme for us to really truthfully endorse and think. It might be the case that a more moderate version of materialism is actually true. So that's worth keeping in mind if you haven't been convinced by Churchland's thoughts. So, stuff to keep in mind. I want you to take some time and think, is Churchland or one of the other materialist theories, are they actually right? I want you to go and evaluate the various arguments for and against yourself. Again, I want you to come to your own conclusions on this sort of thing. I don't think that eliminated materialism is true, but you might. And you might think that there are very good reasons for thinking so. I definitely think there are very plausible reasons, and that very intelligent people think this. But on the flip side, various intelligent people think other things too. So it's never a ringing endorsement, just saying it's plausible. So go, decide for yourself, and happy thinking.